Hello and welcome to virtual Balticon. This is the future from the shadows, noir and science fiction. I'm the moderator, Ted Weber. This panel is being recorded to let you know. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function on the bottom ribbon. It's different from the chat panel, so make sure you're typing it in the Q&A window. And you can submit your questions anytime, but we will get to them after we go through the starting questions. And Balticon is a free event, but donations are appreciated. I'm going to post the donation link in the chat window. So now I'm going to call on our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Charlie Brown.
Thank you, Ted. My name is Charlie Brown. This is my 6th or 7th Balticon. I can't quite remember. I write literary fiction under the name Charles D. Brown. I write fantasy literature, fantasy stories under the name C.D. Brown, and I direct films under the name Charlie Brown, including a modern noir, Angels Die Slowly, and I've also edited 2 noir fantasy books in the Dirty Magic, that's Magic with a K series.
Lee?
I'm Lee Moyer. I'm your virtual art guest of honor, a strange task. I've been coming to Balticon less virtually for a billion years, forever. But now I live on the West Coast, which is why the sun is shining here. I live in Portland, Oregon. I love noir. I've just written one. It's in final stages at an agent, and it's one of my favorite things in the world.
Great. Mark?
My name is Mark Van Name. I've also been coming to Balticon for a long time, since '79, I think was my first. I write science fiction novels, short stories, made my living as a tech journalist for a while, and also love noir in all forms, from film to literature.
And I'm a speculative fiction author, among other things. The first 2 books of my near future cyberpunk trilogy, Sleep State Interrupt and Wrath of Leviathan, can't see them very well, are available online, and the finale will be released September 1st. And they're cyberpunk, so they're very noir. So first, I'd like to play a couple of clips, assuming it works. The first is, let's see. Hold on a second. Not seeing it now. Hold on. Let me try that again. So the first is from a classic noir picture, The Big Sleep, based on the novel by Raymond Chandler. Oh. Well, let's see if I can try that later. For some reason, it worked fine in the practice, but of course it's not working now. So let's go to the questions then. So the first question for the panel: what does noir mean to you, and how do you think its use in science fiction compares to classic noir crime films and books? Let's start with Charlie.
So I have a couple of different definitions for noir, mostly because I think people, when they hear that, they automatically say to themselves, crime fiction, and specifically hard-boiled crime fiction. Now, I agree that that is a huge percentage of noir, but if you go back to the 50s and 40s and 50s, and even to the 30s when they started making the movies, and I would look to what I consider to be one of the best, Sunset Boulevard, has very little crime in it. When I think of noir, I think of a character 99.9% of the time, a man trapped in a situation created by a woman who the French call the femme fatale, and he trying to get out of the situation but having no control and losing it. So I always consider noir to be the place of unhappy endings as opposed to happy endings. But the hard-boiled is where we get is the lingua franca of it. You know, the wisecracks, the snappy dialogue, and then generally the private eye and the voiceover. So yeah, those are my definitions.
Okay. Lee.
Yes. My definition is not completely dissimilar from Charlie's. I think it has to be said, perhaps in other terms, that it is a deeply historically sexist genre for exactly the reasons that he laid out. This is fascinating as we attempt to sort of wrestle with what it means. And those of us who are writing in it today are choosing different paths to do that. Ian Tregillis in his book, Something More Than Night, incredibly strange stuff. Anyway, I could speak endlessly. I will let other people carry on.
Okay. Mark, how about your thoughts?
I think in its historical definition, I would agree with Charlie, but I think there's been a lot of work that is very noirish, that isn't sexist, that isn't carrying the tropes, isn't male-centered. But I would say that what's most important about noir is that it's a worldview. It's a certain darkness. It's a view of an imperfect world. I think you can have happy-ish endings, but as in the real world, no ending is perfectly happy. There are always some winners and losers. I also think that in addition to a very dark mood and a very dark look, noir fiction is almost always a fiction about class. There's almost always the very wealthy class that are pulling the strings, causing a lot of corruption, getting what they want, and using a lot of other people who are then trying to figure out how they can live well in a world that's sort of rigged against them. And so to me, one of the key appeals of noir fiction that has kept it fresh and interesting for a real long time is that we can all relate to that. You know, we're living in a world right now where one could argue that a powerful group is not handling things well for the rest of us. And I don't want to get real political about it, but I do think that this is, every time has a noirish element. You can write noir fiction in any time, and it's about the view you bring to the world.
Can I chime in again for a moment?
Yeah.
So in addition to that, a very cogent and well-stated comment, I have to say that a lot of noir, at least historically, exists in periods of rising tension, rising global tension sometimes. In, for example, Lady in the Lake, Chandler, there's this bizarre comment about pulling up rubber off of a sidewalk that happens early in the book. And a modern reader's like, what the hell is that about? Well, it was about a shortage of rubber in the war. And that idea that things are just about to go very, very bad means that we are living in a very noir time. And it's something that suffuses a lot of noir.
Yeah, if it's okay, sorry to just add one more comment. I would say that that fact is something that you can put in any kind of fiction, in any settings. If you like Richard Morgan, the guy who wrote Altered Carbon and the Takeshi Kovacs books, he wrote a fantasy series that is high fantasy, and it is entirely noir setting and style. The Steel Remains is one of the books, but you can take that worldview and take that sense of decay and put it anywhere. And
I'm, speaking of Altered Carbon, and I'll let you go back, Ted. Speaking of Altered Carbon, I think that's one of the few of the later science fiction dips into noir, where the sex part of it kind of comes in, where there's that feeling of being trapped not only by society, but by your own desires. Of course, Blade Runner has a great femme fatale in it, but I don't think she traps Deckard as much. But in Altered Carbon, you definitely feel that trapped, within his own desires and within society itself.
Yeah, cyberpunk borrows from noir quite a bit, or was inspired by it. Is it found, do you find noir in other subgenres? And I guess you mentioned fantasy. Can you think of other fantasy works that have drawn from noir? Yes.
It was my great pleasure to do this cover for Kim Newman, but one of the stories in here, this chap right here, is called The Big Fish, and it is a gorgeous homage, pastiche to The Big Sleep, but he takes characters from those books. Mr. Krieger, who owns a yacht harbored off of Bay City, which is Santa Monica, and goes full Innsmouth, Lovecraft, government conspiracy. It's extraordinary. And it's complete, all the noir language is there. In fact, the characters are there. And it's a straight up spoof, suspense, H.P. Lovecraft mashup. Incredible.
Like I said, the books I edited, the Dirty Magic books, that was the raison d'etre, was to mix. You had to have the three things that every writer had to have was crime, magic, and it had to take place in a certain setting. So the first was Los Angeles, which I consider to be the home of noir. I lived in Los Angeles for over 10 years, and the shadows of Los Angeles are so sharp. You could literally like cut your fingers on a midday shadow on Hollywood Boulevard. And the other city I chose was my hometown where I live now, New Orleans. And so that had a lot of, so I found when I did the Los Angeles one, everybody wanted to do 40s, 50s. Everybody wanted to have have all the tropes, have the, the fedoras and the, that sort of thing. So they all had magic in them, but everybody still wanted that detective, cutting the look of the 50s man.
Yeah, the Simon Green novels have elements of noir as well as humor. There's just, I think there are tons of fantasy books. You could argue that there are noir elements to the Butcher series. Things are always starting to fall apart, and Dresden is always winning and losing at the same time, and no answer is perfect. And I mean, I think the influences are everywhere.
So why do you think noir, some of noir's bleak themes and imagery have been so resonant down the decades from the 30s, 40s, 50s to even now? And do you think it appeals to a particular audience?
It seems to appeal to a bunch of white guys our age. I don't know.
Charlie?
I think I know that that it does cross a little bit over. It does definitely tend to be an older white male genre, unfortunately. Although I had a few female writers in my books. I think Lee put it the best. It's like in that whenever you find those periods of transition. Now, of course, that's just about every decade of the last 60 years. But those points of transition, people look back on, say, the 80s now, and they say, oh, that was such an innocent time. Well, that's crud, because I was there. And and you can write great noir about nuclear, the impending nuclear war that didn't happen. The 90s was a particularly dark time in pop culture with grunge and stuff like that. But there wasn't a whole, the tension there was societal. You could do, I think, anytime you find yourself, like I said, the outside forces are acting on you and you feel trapped by them, you're always going to be able to find those stories that are just on the darker side, they're just on the, maybe around the millennium, I think was about the last time we had kind of a lightening and people wanted more of the Harry Potter, but then, right after Harry Potter in YA came the Hunger Games, which is not a noir, but certainly has elements of it.
Mark?
Yeah, obviously our panel is not a broad representation of the audience, but I think sales would argue that it's more than people who look like us who enjoy noir fiction. The Blade Runner series obviously did very well. There are a lot of book noir series, and there are a lot of things that steal elements and turn them different ways. A movie I love from quite a while ago, Grosse Pointe Blank, is a comedy about an assassin that has this underpinnings of noir turned into comedy. And one of the people in the chat room has just pointed out there's growing noir in romance themes. I don't agree that it's a male genre. I think it is something that appeals to anybody who looks out at the world and feels like, wow, I have to watch my language, there's a lot of crap out there and the system is rigged. And if you grow up poor, or you grow up in any group that is marginalized, I think you understand quickly how rigged the system is. And to me, that's a ready audience for noir fiction.
And I think you can look to anime too as a growing, definitely Akira, but a lot of the cyberpunk stuff like that. You could take they're taking the same,
Like Ghost in the
roadmap.
Shell.
Right, they're taking the same roadmap that Orson Welles and Billy Wilder and all the great Hollywood directors, they're taking the same angles and they're just making more neon. But yeah, anime is definitely a point, has started to incorporate a lot of those same ideas.
So the chat window is going too fast for me to really follow, but one of the commenters stated that noir has a female audience also.
So I think noir appeals to authors because it's one of the few genres that is not polluted by great man tropes. It's not polluted by, the hero with 1,000 faces. It's somehow immune most of the time to the very samey narrative lies, for want of a better word, that we deal with in almost every other form of fiction. We all know what a third act is. We know what reversals are. We know how these things work. Noir has often a different focus, a different form, different rhythms that are very satisfying to us. And part of why they're satisfying when they're done well is because they are about competence. Noir characters in a deeply unjust world, deeply classist societies, bad things either already happening or just about to break badly, the hero's competence and his integrity, and usually it has been a he historically, those are things that I think appeal to us enormously. But I think there's something else that appeals to us enormously, and I come at this from my career as an artist, which is we get noir, we say film noir, we don't really say book noir. It's not as spoken a theme, and that's because films noir look great. They look high contrast, side lights, upshots. John Hughes, who am I? What's wrong with me? John Huston starts in the same way. John Huston had not made a movie before The Maltese Falcon, and people tend to forget or not know that there were 2 previous attempts at The Maltese Falcon. But it's a case study in how to shoot a movie, how to use symbolism and shadows and all of these very, very beautiful, rich things that in a world that's gray, all this black and white is really powerful.
So that brings us to the next question about noir heroes, or protagonists is a better word. They're more often anti-heroes than heroes. They're typically flawed with cynical attitudes, and they're like we discussed, they're up against a corrupt society, but it's one they can't possibly change, even if they wanted. Usually they don't care. Cyberpunk heroes could be they're sometimes a little different, but they also tend to be marginalized and alienated. They live on the edge of society. So where do character arcs fit into this? And is it possible for a noir hero to successfully impact society in a positive way? Mark?
Sure. So a couple things. First, in Chandler's famous essay where he talks about down these mean streets, what he stressed there about the protagonist was that it was a person who was, as Lee said, quite competent, but who was also essentially good and moral and aware of where the lines were, if sometimes willing to cross those lines to accomplish the right thing. And I think that the essence of noir is, to borrow from a different area entirely, it's working locally to make any global change. You know, the noir protagonist is not someone who is typically going to be concerned with the entire world and trying to start new movements. They're going to be trying to fix a small set of problems in front of them to help a small set of people to make a thing right. It is often the case that, because in fiction we like to up our stakes all the time, that the small thing turns into a much bigger thing that affects a broader set of characters. But ultimately, I think it is the arc of the character to try and move from confronting the problem to some imperfect resolution of the problem while maintaining as much of themselves as they reasonably can. But I think noir fiction acknowledges that as you move through life and as you move through different things, you get soiled. You know, you pay a little bit every time. I write books in which there's violence, and one of the things I try to address is that violence hurts you. Even if you win, it costs you, and it leaves a stain in you, then that stain grows. And I think that's something that people who serve in the military come back with and see. And I think noir heroes are inherently heroes who are slowly getting eaten away.
Lee?
Mark mentions the tremendous essay by Raymond Chandler, which is called The Simple Art of Murder. It's pretty easy to find. So if you have not read it, I really, really recommend it. And this idea of solving small pieces. You mentioned, Ted, that sometimes the detective in a noir detective doesn't care. And I think really very many of them try to put across that they don't care. And part of the richness of the character is how much they actually do care.
Yeah, they often do have a code. It's just not society's code.
Yeah, and I also think I'm reminded that we all know that a cynic is a romantic who's been hurt, and Chandler does that so well. I think if we look upon a historical line, which I tend to do, the early the coming out of the hard-boiled fiction, they did tend to be these personal stories, and then as we went along. You started to see, especially when the one of the first noir revivals was in the 70s, at least in film. Certainly, the books of Jim Thompson in the 60s started to have an effect too. But the first one is we see a movie like Chinatown. Well, now that's confronting a huge issue, which is the city of Los Angeles, and the need for water. There. Now, like I said, I lived in LA, and I lived right next door to the Mulholland Fountain And during our last huge drought, Mulholland was the guy who stole all the water that made Los Angeles available. And he's kind of the character that John Huston plays in Polanski's film. And during our last big drought, the Mulholland fountain was turned off. So I noted the irony of that. But that was a big, that was one where the Jack Nicholson character is not only fighting this one small mystery, then he comes up with this huge societal issue of, how do we even live? And he ends up losing in that case. I think a lot of the 70s films, you're going to see them losing. And then in the 80s was more of a kind of a pastiche era where he was like, we're back to the fedoras and that sort of stuff. And now I think we're starting to look towards the future with that. And then again, now we're starting to confront bigger and bigger issues and not just trying to solve one murder, but how does this one murder fit into these larger conspiracies and machinations of society that are beyond our control?
Like Altered Carbon and The Expanse. I think The Expanse is one of the best science fiction shows created recently. And its characters are, some of them are very cynical, and they certainly, for the most part, are kind of on the underclass.
I think the Thomas Jane character in The Expanse is the perfect noir hero, and if it had just been about him, I love everything about The Expanse, but if it had just been about him and his storyline, that would have been enough for me. I would have been all aboard for him.
I'm going to turn to the Q&A. So there's a question. So the noir term first came from movies. So what is the relationship to the pulp mags of the 40s and 50s?
I think we tend to call those hard-boiled as opposed to noir. I heard the phrase Roman noir, which is black novel, applied to Jim Thompson, but I don't know if that ever caught on.
There were in the 40s and into the 50s a bit, but during the height of the pulp era and even into the 30s, there were plenty of noir pulps, and some of them were bad, but some of them had very, very good writers in them. And like the Spicy Detective, Weird Detective, all sorts of pulps like that people were exploring that literature at the same time as the movies. I think the movies gather our attention because they are a larger mass media, but it's all over the written word as well.
And some more survived than the books. Sorry, Lee, but I feel like more of the movies have survived. I think the books have been, it's really hard to find a lot of those. You have to really go trolling in the used bookstores to find them.
Lee?
Black Mask was a very popular pulp, and that's where Hammett got his start, Chandler, all sorts of guys publishing in these pulpy places, and then Chandler particularly weaving different stories together, not always perfectly, but basically taking stories that paid him a pittance the first time, winding them together, and making a basket that would hold enough, carry enough weight to get made into a movie, though he didn't always know, who killed the chauffeur in Big Sleep.
Have you heard that? You know that story? Does everybody know that story?
Tell it.
Oh, well, William Faulkner wrote the screenplay for The Big Sleep.
Yeah, that's right.
And
he was one of three writers.
Yeah, he's one of three writers, but he called Raymond Chandler, who was another famous couldn't sleep guy. He called him at like 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Ray, who killed the chauffeur?"
Oh, yeah.
Chandler said, "I don't know. I just needed a body." So,
yeah, his plots tend
one of the
to
most
be
famous
so
Hollywood
convoluted.
stories.
A plot's convoluted when even the author can't keep track of it.
Well, if the author had drunk less, he would have been probably a little smarter about it. But that film is one of the first weirdest conjunctions of science fiction and noir. because one of its authors was Lee Brackett,
True.
the woman who would later run the first draft of Empire Strikes Back. So yeah, she was quite a character in the old Hollywood.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's another question. Do you have any comments about the movie Alphaville?
Which one?
Alphaville? I haven't
Oh,
seen
Alphaville.
it, so I don't.
I can talk to Alphaville.
Okay.
Of course, that's Godard. And Godard Godard's almost all of his early films from the late 50s to the mid 60s were in that kind of weird pastiche area. So Alphaville, I actually, if you haven't seen it, it uses these real locations like factories and stuff like that to tell a science fiction story. I would say that Alphaville's the first cyberpunk. Am I going out on a limb for that one? It features and actually this is the funny thing about Alphaville. Lemmy, the Lemmy, I can't remember what the guy
From Motorhead?
No. The actual guy's name was Lemmy.
Caution.
He was a hero in French pulp novels, and Godard got the book Alphaville and put Lemmy in, and blew people's minds. It was like, this is not, he was like a popular character, and all of a sudden he's in this weird, go nowhere, really slow. What the hell's going on? Let me caution. Thank you for you. He was kind of a famous character that Godard messed with. It's almost like if we took Dick Tracy and put him into Chinatown, and you're like, wait a minute, what? How does this work?
Put him into Blade Runner.
Yeah,
so
put him into Blade Runner. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Here's a question on a different tangent. So comedy, science fiction, and fantasy can be very hit and miss. I find that when combined with noir, the humor is apt to be more universal. Comments?
I think there's a really fine line between noir, and this might just sound crazy, between noir and farce. If you read The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett, it is this very bizarre, light comic noir, and yet it works, I think, surprisingly well. It's fascinating to me that Chandler went to the same British university as P.G. Wodehouse. There are a lot of, I think, surprising similarities between a farce of the period, like particularly the first version of My Man Godfrey, with noir. They seem often to be concerned with the same ideas of class, of perspective, perception, and of course the early ones were black and white, so they had some of that great look and cinematography in common. So I think it's more natural than not, and I think the Coen brothers are probably the best people in film putting those pieces together today. One of my favorite two modern noirs is Miller's Crossing. So.
What's the other?
It depends on what day you catch me. The utterly bizarre Paul Thomas Anderson rendition of Inherent Vice.
I love it.
That is the strangest, God, so amazing. Such a weird movie. I love it.
I'm a huge fan of that writer. Oh God, why is my name?
Pynchon.
Huh?
Thomas Pynchon.
Thomas Pynchon, yeah, and Pynchon, all of his stuff is very noir influenced, but it's also avant-garde weirdness. Isn't that, to speak to comedy, I think that's why I was drawn to noir because that as a writer, because like, don't we all want to be that snappy? Don't we all want to be that funny as Philip Marlowe, to be able to hit these hip, quick lines and walk into somewhere and say, oh, I got the hangover of 12 Swedes, and looking a woman up and down going, oh, she was crazy as waltzing mice. I mean, I think that's part of the appeal is the language. Chandler in particular is the one, because
Uh,
he was
King
so
snappy dialogue.
so snappy, and yeah, it's like that's where the cynicism comes in. And someone says sarcasm is my language. Yeah, you speak sarcasm fluently. So we have to. I think that's definitely part of it.
Yeah,
Mark.
to Lee's point, I think that what brings those two together is that they are both genres of artifice. They require an enormous amount of structure and a consistent worldview, a style, an obsession with style that a more naturalist fiction does not, whether that's in writing or in film. And so when you have anything that is heavy in artifice, you can just pivot that artifice a little bit and tell that story with a slightly different structure, and it becomes a different kind of story. But I also think that the snappiness of the dialogue is a necessary part of the worldview. It's an incorporation of the worldview, because the character has to show you consistently how they feel and how they see the world as bleak and flawed. And the best way to do that is through their dialogue and the actions. Because a lot of the time in these movies are actually kind of slow on action and high on artifice and structure.
And high on character.
High on character.
So much of Hammett's work in particular, something like The Dane Curse, is these very strange interwoven stories. Here's a story about a cult. Here's a story about a jeweler. Here's a story about Devil's Island. Here are these very odd things that have been put together. And there is an incredible appeal, to me at least, of this sort of interwoven contextual deliciousness, because the world is not simple and straightforward as so many stories would have you believe. And then my other answer to Mark is, if you catch me on a different day, I will say LA Confidential.
Yeah. I also think when you look at the filmmakers, you'll see that the filmmakers of noir, with the exception, Wells never really made a comedy, but the same one who made The Big Sleep makes His Girl Friday. The same one who makes Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, then later on goes Some Like It Hot and The Apartment, which are two of the greatest comedies. So you saw that the directors easily pivoted from one to the other.
Mark's brilliant comment about artificiality, of the specificity of this world that is heightened, is a reason that I have long held that, with one exception that proves the rule, there are no good screwball comedies in color. The one exception being What's Up, Doc? But it is very hard to heighten when you are having the full palette range. I love the Coen brothers, and I just rewatched Intolerable Cruelty, but it's not as good as it needs to be. So yeah, it's challenging. It's challenging to maintain that degree of heightened reality.
I think it only had, I know there's a couple of sitcoms that I can point to that said, I felt like I was getting a real screwball comedy, happy endings in particular, but it's very few and far between.
So here's another question. What 1940s noir films would you say have the biggest influence on modern science fiction? Whoever wants to go first.
I think Sunset Boulevard is just so strong. And it's probably more applicable across a range than a lot of other things. The voiceover is spectacular because it's from a very specific point of view. It's gothic as hell. It's got all of these very strange notes about a society that is, film was a new genre in a way. And the fact that it was already passing into another generation, to me, makes it sort of more relevant to science fiction and things moving forward era to era.
Yeah, I honestly think, and I hate to say this as betraying my age, but I think it's a generational thing too. I think that the movies of the 40s are probably not influencing the younger crop of writers, and they're being influenced by the movies and books they read. Neuromancer, which seems very recent to me, is a 1985 book, and it's quite possible to be a very successful SF writer and never have read that book. And so I think, for example, there's generations for which the seminal noir movie is Blade Runner, even though that is vastly farther in time. And as with all art, it moves forward. But, for me, I'm still someone who finds I'm doing the one that, I'm forgetting the name of the movie, but it's a very quiet little movie in which they're chasing a box that at the end of it, and they open it, and basically there's an atom bomb. Lee, you look like you remember that.
Would that be Repo Man?
No, not Repo Man.
I was just about to talk about that one. Yeah, that's a Mickey Spillane, and that's book. Kiss Me Deadly is I still think that's one.
The first Kiss Me Deadly, yeah.
Yeah, the first Kiss Me Deadly
with Ralph Meeker
from the 50s. Robert Aldrich, I believe, directed it. And Kiss Me Deadly was going to be my answer, because I know that the film buffs still dig that movie, because that's a bizarre film, and I love it.
Very cool.
Because it's one of the ones where Mike Hammer doesn't get everything that he wants, unlike in the books, which are, I like Spillane, but you got to dig through some dirt to get it. But Kiss Me Deadly, that one is just like, yeah, it ends, and it's got a huge influence on Pulp Fiction, which is 25 years old. I mean, because Marcellus opens the box and you see the light. That's straight out of Kiss Me Deadly. Yeah, but I say Tarantino still has influence, and there's still many Tarantinites in Hollywood trying to across all genres. I'm sure a lot of them are waiting for his cyberpunk movie.
There was a question about David Lynch asking if he was somewhat noir, and maybe in a bizarre kind of way, like a Eraserhead has a kind of noir kind of lighting and so forth. And Blue Velvet is kind of a noirish kind of plot, sort of. But I don't know, he's his own thing, kind of.
I think they're all noir, though. I think they all are, especially.
Yeah.
What was the one?
Lost Highway.
Lost Highway is straight up noir. It's just bizarre. Yeah, you just take the realism out of it.
Well, it's
impressionist noir.
It is sufficiently heightened.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of Lynch's hallmarks, no matter what you're watching. I know too much about him to like him in any way, but his work is so heightened, and when he works with someone like Mark Frost, you end up with a story that can roughly be followed. So yeah, I think he has his moments, absolutely.
And I think he's also about, the veneer. Like, this is kind of a noir thing too. You have your societal veneer, and as soon as you pierce that veneer and you're into the hidden world, that is a huge trope across all hard-boiled and noir stuff. Is the protagonist finding there's this whole weird world that is infecting, and that's Blue Velvet, and that's Lost Highway to a certain extent too.
Another quick question: Bester's "The Star Is My Destination."
Don't know.
Yeah, I think in many ways, yes. Bester was an amazing writer that I think most people aren't reading today, and should. His story, Fondly Fahrenheit, is one of the darkest and scariest stories I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. But I think he had a tremendous eye for understanding the class and societal effects of technologies. In his teleportation book, one of the things is that the very, very wealthy, even a world where everyone can teleport, they travel in the slowest possible way. And to the point that one very wealthy person has a train that he travels on, and he has people laying the track ahead of him and taking up the track behind him, because he doesn't care how long it takes. He doesn't have to. He wants to show off his wealth. And it's a very classic setting and worldview for a lot of noir.
So it looks like we're at the 5-minute mark. So I'm going to ask each of you to wrap up, like give some closing thoughts, and then tell the viewers where you can find you in 1 minute or so.
Well, I will type to find me. That's easy.
Okay. Charlie, go.
Okay, sure. I would just like to say that I love Noir because, again, like Lee was saying, it's such a great playground, and my novel Vamp City is a fantasy novel of vampires, but it's really a Dashiell Hammett. It's really a Dashiell Hammett novel because I'm writing about the mob, and I'm writing about all sorts of interesting. So if you can find all of my stuff at charliebrownwriter.com. You can find my noir neo-noir movie Angels Die Slowly on the Mubi MUBI app and streaming, and C.D. Brown for fantasy, Charles D. Brown for literary fiction. Thank you.
Mark?
Yeah, I put my my contact info in the chat window. It's just markvandame.com.
Okay, any final thoughts?
It's a great genre.
Yeah.
And I'm Ted Weber. The first 2 books of my near future cyberpunk trilogy, Sleep State Interrupt and Wrath of Leviathan, are available online, and the finale will be released September 1st. You can find all kinds of things at my website, tcweber.com. So we actually have 3 minutes left because you guys posted your stuff in the chat.
We have one question still.
Yes, we have 1 question left, so we'll take it. So the classic noir films were made under the censorship of the Green Production Code. So there's a game of getting stuff by the censors. But in some ways it encouraged a snappy dialogue, like between Bogart and Bacall in The Big Sleep. Inference instead of just on the nose. So do you think that helped make noir what it is?
I would say absolutely.
Yeah, I think it did. Maybe not in obvious ways or ways that the authors would have wished, but yeah, absolutely. The vessel that we know on film had to be poured through this particularly weird sieve, and it produced some great stuff.
And I also think there is this element of the subject matter of fighting against a crooked authority is something the writers, not to go too meta, are doing in trying to write their dialogue. They're always, if somebody puts a constraint on your art, it is a natural reaction to push against that constraint and see just how far you can go. And I think that happens in the dialogue.
And there's a part of the production code specifically said criminals cannot get away with the crime, and so therefore right. You're going to have the noir here. You're going to have your hero either killed or arrested at the end, double indemnity or whatever. Yeah. Spoiler alert for a 60-year-old film.
I want to thank all the panelists. Charlie, Lee, Mark, you've been great. I want to thank all the people that tuned in to watch. And if you have more questions, we will be on Discord on the channel, the literary channel. So I will post it into the chat, but go to Discord and scroll all the way down. And with that, thank you all.